Welcome to the View from the Penalty Box podcast with Cam Connor. Classic hockey stories from one of hockey's toughest enforcers.
Hello everyone, I'm Cam Connor. This is my fourth podcast. I'm here with my son Kris.
So hello everyone, and we're actually really excited for today's episode because we get to celebrate an amazing accomplishment, an accomplishment I don't think we ever thought would happen. As you know, Dad, we got to number 2 in the Canadian sports iTunes rankings, and we actually got top 5 in the States. So I don't know how people are finding this podcast. I think people were excited to hear about your friendship with Roddy Piper and probably the previous episode about Wayne Gretzky. So now that we know people are actually listening to this podcast, we have to keep up the momentum. You ready, Dad?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Where do we start?
Okay, well, we actually got a few questions. So the first one is from Adam, and he sent us an email at viewfromthepenaltybox@gmail.com. And it's kind of a long question, but I will read it quickly. Hey boys, really enjoy the podcast. I am curious if you watched the documentary Ice Guardians, which covers enforcers in the NHL. It's good, entertaining, and pretty much throws Bob Probert out as the best ever, which I can't disagree with. This may be one of those Howe or Gretzky, Lemieux or conversations, but I was curious on your thoughts on the best enforcers ever. Keep up the great work.
Well, let me jump right in. You know, anybody can win on any given night, but to me, I agree that Bob Probert, you got to put him up in the top 2 or 3. And why do I do that? Bob would show up just like Dave Semenko. He would show up every night. There's a challenge, he would fight. And Bob was one of those fighters. He would stand there, and if you want to punch each other for 3 minutes, he would fight for 3 minutes. He was never a dirty fighter. He never jumped you from behind. He wasn't a guy who was yipping and yapping at you and calling you names. He did what he had to do. He was quiet. And I think if you talk to any of his teammates over the years, they love Bob, and they would all agree. You know, I come from a different era. The boys today, they're huge. When I started in 74, they used to describe me in the paper as the big forward, Cam Connor. And I'm 6'1.5" and about 205, 206. Today, that is the average size of an NHL player. So, you know, when you look at a few years ago, George Laraque, and I believe he was something like 6'5", and 245 or 250 or thereabouts. Now, those are big boys. I mean, you look at a Chara. Good thing he doesn't have a mean streak in him. And what is he, like 6'8" or 6'9"? You know, back in my day, there was guys like Dave Brown, and he played with the Oilers for a while. He played with the Flyers. Tough boy. Pretty glad I never had to cross paths with him. I hate to think what he might have done to me.
And what about someone that you actually fought? This could be a good full episode on fighting and your different fights that you've been in, but who's someone you remember as a really tough fighter that you fought with?
Well, you know, when I played in the World Hockey, for example, and we all seen that movie Slapshot, and they got in the movie the Hanson brothers, and, you know, in reality, they're the Carlson brothers, and that whole team was some tough boys. Kurt Brackenberry, they were a tough team. And so I fought all the Carlson brothers, and, you know, in my opinion, Jack was the toughest of all the Carlson brothers. And I remember I got Jack down, and I felt like I was on top of a Brahma bull. I said, boy, I'm not letting this guy up. You can just feel his strength. And again, I've mentioned Ben Wilson, I think, over the past little while when I talk about tough guys. He played in the Fly organization, defenseman. Tough as they come. He was a good stand-up fighter, and the only time I fought him is when I was with the Oilers, and I just came off a broken hand. And your hand should be in the cast for sure 6 weeks. And they had my cast off like within 3 weeks, and next thing you know, I'm playing, and the first game was against the Flyers and Ben Wilson. And I took him out in the boards, right in front of the Oilers bench, and he elbowed me right in the face. I have no choice, I've got to fight the guy. And I can only hit him with one hand, because when you take your hand out of a cast, it's like a little girl's hand. And if you punch somebody with that hand just out of a cast, you're going to break it again. So I fought him with one hand, and I was able to get a couple uppercuts in, and he got me down, and, thank heavens he was nice to me. He didn't thump me too bad that night. But it was actually pretty close, and it's actually, you can Google and see that fight. On any given night, you got guys in Montreal like Larry Robinson. He's a good-sized guy, but he doesn't have a mean streak. He doesn't like to fight. He doesn't want to fight. But don't get him mad, because if you start fighting him, you're going to wish you didn't. So, really, Kris, I could go on and on and on, but on any given night, seriously, back in my day, anybody could beat anybody.
Okay, so we also have a Twitter question, and if you want to interact with my dad, his Twitter handle is CamConnorNHL, and this one is from Mitzi, and they ask about the Roddy Piper episode last week. They said that it's well known that Roddy Piper gives a really good promo, and was he always a good talker and speaker in high school?
Rod was the best. I think in one of my podcasts when I was talking about Rod, I said he could talk a bird out of a tree. That wasn't an exaggeration. People loved Rod. He was tough, but he never acted tough in the streets. He didn't walk around with a chip on his shoulder. He would rather talk his way out of a fight. And he could. There were he used to bounce in a bar in Winnipeg, and some of the tough boys from the other end of town would show up, and these guys were brawlers. They were well known in Winnipeg. And, he never tried to fight them, and he would talk to them, and there was never any trouble ever for the years that Rod bounced in a bar. Like, he didn't have to fight as a bouncer, because he was so good with people. He didn't put you on the spot. He didn't try to pretend he was tougher than you. High school. The teachers all loved Rod. He was somebody that you couldn't really get mad at, because he had that leave it to Beaver smile. Rod could always talk. When I was with him, I tried to keep my mouth shut and stay out of trouble, and Rod could always talk our way out of trouble.
Okay, thanks, Dad. And I actually have a question, and this kind of leads into more of the wrestling-themed podcast that we're doing today with our final look back at Roddy Piper. You talked about the early years with him, and we're going to look at more his professional years in wrestling and then the time after he retired and ultimately his passing. But to do with wrestling, I know that you, throughout the years, got to meet Andre the Giant, and that must have been something else. So if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to meet Andre the Giant.
I was living in New York, and Rod came into town. I was probably a 5-minute drive from at the time it was called WWF headquarters in Greenwich, Connecticut. So when Rod came in for business or fighting in Long Island or New Haven, Connecticut or Madison Square Gardens, we would always hook up. So he had asked me, he said, well, let's go for a beer tonight, and he brought some of the wrestlers. And there was, like you said, Andre the Giant, the Hart brothers were there, Mean Gene Okerlund. We always hung out with Cowboy Bob Orton. And I remember sitting at the bar beside Andre the Giant. And I don't think anybody could say that they're used to having a gentleman the size of Andre the Giant sitting next to him. His head was as big as a medicine ball. And I remember he'd order some kind of drink that came in a glass. And he would put his hands around that glass, and you couldn't even see the glass in his hands. And his fingers, I look at them, they look like dill pickles. They were just unbelievable. And when you're talking to Andre, at least my experience, I think when you get to be that big, and what was he, like 500 pounds? When you get to be the size of Andre, I think your vocal cords aren't that coordinated, because it was hard to understand them. And, it was just neat being next to a guy that size. And so, yeah, that was quite an experience that I've never forgot.
Okay, Dad, so I think it's time to wrap up our podcast with Roddy Piper with this second part. This might be a little tough to talk about, but I know you had a lot of great memories with him over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So why don't we start with you both kind of went your separate ways to pursue your careers, and how did that go?
Well, you know, when I left Flin Flon Bombers, I ended up, instead of going to the NHL, I went to the World Hockey, and I played for a team called Phoenix Roadrunners in the World Hockey Association. So when I was living in Phoenix, Rod was, you know, he was like 20, 21, 22, and he was just trying to make his mark in the wrestling world. He would be driving from place to place on a no-name circuit, and when you're just a new guy, and they hadn't really discovered, you know, Rod's ability to talk, because, I mean, when you look at his Piper Pit, unbelievable the way Rod presented himself for that. It was just really interesting. And so Rod would show up in Phoenix, and I was making some very good money back in those days. Very good. And, Rod and I, we'd go out and we'd have beers. We usually did, and talk. And Rod did so much for me growing up. He gave me confidence that I lacked. And I really do believe he was one of the reasons that I made it in professional hockey. He came along at the right time of my life, and he made me feel I was better than I was. And I played that way. So when he was in Phoenix, like, I know he was making nothing. And I said to Rod, hey, Rod, hey, let me give you some coin. I said, I wouldn't even make a dent in my piggy bank here. You're my buddy. And Rod was so proud. He would not take any money from me. And believe me, this would be nothing I'd ever hold over his head or I'd ever bring up again. It would make me feel good for me to be able to help my friend out and give him some cash to, you know, help him out. But he was too proud. Like, if he offered me cash, I might have probably said, sure, buddy. But he wasn't that type of guy. He wouldn't take my money no matter what. And so, you know, we spent time together in Phoenix. And then I went to Houston Aeros from Phoenix. And Rod and I, we lost track of each other when I got to Houston from Phoenix. And I would say, you know, I kind of wondered about where my buddy was, but it was pretty hard to track each other down. We didn't have cell phones back in those days, and his parents had moved, and really it would have been up to Rod to try to track me down by getting a hold of my parents in Winnipeg. But like I said, 4 or 5 years went by. I thought about Rod quite a bit. We each went on with our life. And unfortunately, I got sent to the Rangers farm team in New Haven, Connecticut. So I was down in the minors in the American Hockey League, and I saw a poster up at the rink. And they were advertising the wrestlers that are coming in the next night or two. And I said, Roddy Piper, look at that. He's back. So we were on the road that day, so I asked the head of security for the New Haven Coliseum, it was called. I said, Rod and I are good friends. Could you please, you know, bump into Rod and let him know that, you know, I'm okay, and here's my number if he wants to get a hold of me. Then, you know, I told the head of security that we would get back late that night, but it wouldn't be at the match. Well, when I talked to the head of security the next day, he had said that Rod was so excited that he had the PA announcer in the New Haven Coliseum announce, Cam Connor, please go to such a room. Please go. Even though I wasn't in the building. So Rod wanted to see where I sat in the dressing room. So the security guy opened up our dressing room and went in there. And Rod, he had the wrestlers that were on the card that night sign a hockey stick for me. So they all signed the hockey stick for me. And he gave the head of security his contact information.
I just got to interrupt. Do you still have this hockey stick?
You know what? I do have the hockey stick, but the problem was he wrote in ink, and that doesn't last too long. You know, you need a Sharpie or something, and so I do have it, but the names have faded. That would have been neat to have for sure. It was again, we're back to our old selves again, and
so it's interesting because probably right around that time, maybe a little bit later, Roddy Piper started one of the iconic bits of his career, which is or was Piper's Pit. What did you think about that?
In my opinion, I think that's really what Rod was all about. You know, he was a little man in a big man's game. And so, I don't, like you said last time, I thought he was a world champ, but he never did win the championship. I think where his fame came from is his ability to speak. And so much of what he did in Piper's Pit, it just came to him. He didn't really... I mean, there was sometimes I think some of the things were choreographed. But if you know Rod, he's more of a spontaneous guy, and he thinks on his feet. He thinks very quickly. And, the thing is, when you're on television, they can do it again. If he's made a mistake, well, they'll redo it again. Rod was unbelievable in Piper's Pit. And I really mean it, not because he's my buddy. I think he was the best. He was a natural, and he was funny at the stuff that he would say would just come to him. So, yeah, I think he was great at Piper's Pit.
And do you have any memories? I know that you were invited to watch a few of his matches, and did you actually get to go to WrestleMania? There was some important match of his that you watched.
I went in Long Island, New York, Nassau Coliseum it's called. That's where the Islanders used to play out of. Rod gave my wife and I, Sherilyn, some tickets to a match where he was actually boxing Mr. T. Back in those days, wrestling never admitted it. Like we used to say to Rod, that's fake, isn't it? And Rod would get so mad if you call wrestling fake. And then as years go by, he started saying, okay, it's sort of fake, but we call it choreographed. So, but he wasn't at that point where he was going to admit it. But I fought Rod enough time with, street fights and boxing gloves on. So I know what he could do. And when I saw him in the ring with Mr. T, I knew right away that wasn't the guy that I fought before. So I knew right then and there for 100% certainty that that was choreographed. Because if Rod would have let go the way he could fight, Mr. T wouldn't have had a chance at all. So that was one of my more interesting fights. I was in the 5th row, and Billy Crystal was, in the row in front of me. And so there was a lot of celebrities there. And, of course, it was sold out.
So speaking of all these fightings and the fact that Rod was your friend, did you ever consider getting into the wrestling world, especially after you retired from hockey?
Funny you mentioned that because I ended my career, I hurt my back really bad, and I had trouble. I remember, Kris, when you were a little boy, Mom wasn't home, and you ran out into the street, and I couldn't do a thing about it. I couldn't get there. I couldn't run. I could hardly walk. And so it took years before the body started healing itself, and I could get back to normal again.
And that should be another episode topic, is why you retired and everything that you had to go through.
Yeah, believe me, there's a story there. And his name's Craig Patrick, so that'll be another day. So, Kris, to answer your question about did I think about maybe wrestling, Rod asked me if I'd be interested. He said, it'd be great. He said, let's you and I do a tag team against a couple other wrestlers. And he said, we can make some money. And I said, Rod, absolutely not. I just got over this back injury. And one pile drive or one body slam or Andre the Giant or somebody of his size falling on me, I said, no way I ever want to go through that back injury again. And I didn't care what kind of money they offered me. So I said, thank you. It would have been fun, but no thank you.
So before we go into the topic of the last time that you met Rod, are there any memories throughout the years that we didn't cover that you could bring up? Just some fun facts.
Well, there's just different things that, I don't know if it's of any interest to anybody else, but I wrote down a few bullets of things that just pop in my mind when I think of Roddy Piper, a.k.a. real name was Rod Toombs. I remember when he came to our house in New York and he'd sleep over and he'd get up. It was kind of, I don't know, I can't speak for anybody else, but I don't sleep with any clothes on. And when I saw Rod get up...
We don't need to know that, but keep going.
Well, no, the point is, Rod got up and he wears penguin pajamas with penguins all over. And it just didn't seem right that a tough guy like him wear penguin pajamas. That always made me chuckle. And it wasn't just that night. We'd be on the road somewhere in a hotel and he'd wear his penguin PJs.
I think I've actually seen pictures because you thought that was so ridiculous. So I have seen pictures, but we won't post them out of respect.
I used to chirp him all the time about those PJs, but and I think back when we were living in New York and Rod again would come by to the New York area, and I would take him to the hospital. There was various hospitals that I was scheduled to go talk to people. And guys that I played hockey with knew that I was buddies with Rod, and their kids were big wrestling fans said, can I bring Rod over to meet the kids? And I kind of felt bad because everybody wanted a piece of Rod. And, I think with myself, I didn't care he was a popular wrestler. He was just my buddy from Winnipeg. But, I would ask him because I know that somebody else that I know and their kids really wanted to meet him. So Rod would kind of say, okay, let's do it. And we go over and visit some of my buddies and their kids. And then when we go to the hospital, that was kind of interesting because we went up to, there was in some of the hospitals, there were certain people that we went to see. And then all of a sudden word get around in the hospital that not so much me, but Roddy Piper was in there. And the kids come out of, there was a gazillion kids in the hallways, in people's rooms, wherever Rod went. And they want autographs. And so Rod's he's going to sign everything he can. But the two of us, spelling isn't our strong suit. And somebody would say, hey, could you sign it too? And he'd throw a name out, or she'd throw a name out, and Rod would kind of slyly say, how do you spell that? And I go, I don't know. So we both would chuckle, and Rod would do his best to try to spell somebody's name.
You should tell the story of, what was that, like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, where you helped Rod in Toronto at one of his big Comic-Con type events.
Yeah, Rod asked me to come down there and help him out. There was a lot of named people at this. To name a few, there was Linda Blair, there was Leonard Nimoy, and what's Captain Kirk?
William Shatner?
William Shatner. Yeah. There was that little mini-me, I think that's his name, Vern somebody.
Austin Powers.
What a little pain that guy is, that's all I gotta say. And there was quite a few other celebrities there. I think Alice Cooper was there. And they were signing autographs, so Rod just needed some help. He had one other fellow, so he flew me down from Edmonton to Toronto. We spent 2.5 days him signing autographs. And then he asked me to go back to New York with him. He gave me a good reason, so I said I'd go. We stayed in a hotel right across the street from LaGuardia. And Ric Flair was staying there, so we went and had beer with Ric Flair. And what a nice man Ric is, so down to earth. That was really enjoyable meeting Ric Flair. So Rod's got a match coming up now. He's had both hips replaced. He had told me at one point that, his wrestling career was over. Then the next thing you know, I see him on TV fighting again with 2 replaced hips. And he just said that Ted Turner offered him so much money, he had to come back. So this match was in Madison Square. And so, I used to play out of Madison Square, so, I'm familiar with it. So he got me a pass. And you have to wear the pass all the time. So I got down at the dressing room level, but I would never go into the dressing room. I just kind of stood out and off to the side, just next to this hallway when I was waiting for Rod. I think everybody knows who John Cena is. That is one big boy. And so I'm standing off the main walkway, off to the side, and I got my pass. It's a stick-on, and I have it on my thigh on my leg. I didn't have it on my chest, visible. And he had to go out into the ring, so he was getting himself all psyched up. And I'm not even anywhere near this guy. And he's walking with his head down, and he went off the main path area, and then he come up, and he bumps into me, and he says to me, get the F out of the way. What the F, you doing here? I'm going to kick this out of you. And he went berserk on me. And he said, if you're still here when my match is over, I'm coming after you. And I don't really know where his head's at. I watched the Bellas, it's called, on TV, and his wife, and nice lady, and he acts like a gentleman, but he wasn't a gentleman that day, I guarantee you. I'm in my 50s now, and John Cena wants to beat me up. And I'm saying, well, okay, it wouldn't be a wise move because I'm not in shape anymore, and that guy doesn't have an ounce of body fat.
So you honestly didn't say anything to instigate this at all?
No, I give you my word. I know it's hard to believe, but maybe when I was younger, but not in my 50s. I know better. Especially him. This is what he does for a living. So, anyway, I'm a little nervous now because, he's gone out to fight. And I remember Rod walked by. I said, Rod, Cena's going to get me. Rod never fought any battles for me. And I know me, when I was younger, in my prime, I probably would have said, I would have fought him. I'm pretty sure I would have, but I would have got the first few shots in. I don't know what would happen after that. but I probably was stupid enough to fight him. But not when I'm in my 50s. So I'm a little worried now. And so he fights and he comes back and he kind of looks at me and he heads down a hallway towards the dressing rooms, and I'm thinking, uh-oh. So again, Rod didn't care. I'm on my own. So, I don't know, half hour goes by and Rod comes out. He says, Cam, why don't you come in the dressing room instead of standing out here? And all the wrestlers changed together. And I said, well, Cena in there? He said, no, he's not in there. I said, okay. So I went in there and all the wrestlers were in there. And there was no room beside Rod. So I remember sitting beside this guy. He's over 500 pounds. He was a big guy. And we started talking, and I was still a little worried about Cena. I said, Cena, is he gone already? He goes, well, he's probably around somewhere. Why? And I told him what had happened. He said to me, yeah, he could be a little crazy. He said, you just stick with me, he said, and I'll take care of you. Man, that guy had to go up to take a pee. I was thinking I should go with him in case Cena came in. But I hung back, and as it worked out, Cena did come in, and he looks at me, and I'm going, oh, my Lord, but at least I got this big fella who's going to help me. Anyways, I guess Cena started relaxing. I don't really know what happened, but he didn't come after me, which I'm grateful for sure. Yeah, that was my trip with Rod in there into Madison Square. I haven't forgot that. He still scares me. And, when I think about, things that he's told me over the years, well, one of the things with Rod, I remember when we would go out, whether it was for dinner, lunch, a beer, and if I had some friends with me, from the New York area that wanted to meet Rod, Rod always felt that he had to pay. Every time he'd be the guy pulling out his money to pay at the end of the night, and he's buying for 2, 3, 4, 5 guys. I'd say, Rod, you don't have to pay. No, I'll get it. But, it started to bother me after a while because there wasn't many people that were willing to say, you know what, Rod, don't. So I made sure after a while that, Rod, I got money too. You don't always have to buy. I know you're well off, but you don't have to buy all the time. So I know Rod was, I don't know what the word is, grateful. I don't even think that's the word, but I think he respected me that I wasn't letting him pay for the food or the booze. So he was pretty generous to a fault. One of the things I remember about wrestling is Cowboy Bob Orton. I don't know if he was a manager or tag team partner, but they used to hang around quite a bit, and Rod would bring Cowboy Bob around, and Bob was a hell of a nice guy. And, when I first met him, he had this cast on his hand, up his arm to as high as your elbow. And he broke a bone wrestling. And, every time I saw him, he had it on. Then I didn't see Cowboy for over a year, and then I ran into him somewhere, and he still had his cast on. And I said, Cowboy, you still got that prop on? He said, prop? He said, you know what? If I don't fight, if us as wrestlers, if we don't fight, we don't get paid. And, in hockey, you get hurt, you get to heal, you get pretty good medical attention, and then when you're healthy, for the most part, you come back and you continue. But with Cowboy, he said, it's been a year or two that he had this cast on. And, he said, I have to fight. So he said they'd set the bone so it's lined up, and he'd get in the ring, and then after X amount of fights, the bone would no longer be in place, so they had to reset it again. And I always felt bad for those wrestlers. Rod had told me that at one point, and I'm assuming this is accurate, he said that he fought 93 nights in a row in 93 different cities. That's going to burn anybody out. And Rod's, as I've said many times before, he's not a big man as compared to the guys he's fighting. And so he took a beating in there. He'd come over to the house, and he'd be sitting on the couch, and we'd get up to go somewhere. He couldn't get up. I had to pull him off the couch. His back was all screwed up. He'd have me walk on his back. I thought I'd hurt him, but he said, no, you got him, man. Straighten my back out. His wrist was screwed up. These guys fought in pain all the time. Like those guys, I take my hat off to them. Rod made millions in the fighting business, but knowing what I know, what Rod told me, I would never, ever do that for a living. Like, not a chance. It's such a cutthroat business, but they don't have any off season. As I said earlier, If you get hurt, you don't get paid if you don't fight. They don't have a union. It's a tough life, those wrestlers.
And that's probably why he tried to branch out to acting, and he was really successful. I don't know how many movies he made, but I'm guessing at least 50. And he's probably most well known for They Live. So I guess you probably weren't surprised that he could also do well in acting.
No, again, it's that's what he would like to do. I think you need to get a good role, and you need to be best, because there's lots of actors that are B actors and C actors, and I think it takes a while to hone your skills for these kind of things. And so I think Rod would have ended up to be a better actor. I don't think there's anybody that could take the Rock spot. That guy's outstanding. But I think that's what Rod was aiming for, was to get to that level.
Yeah, but Rod probably also paved the way to show the industry that wrestlers can act.
Well, you're probably right about that. Rod, he was. They broke the mold after that guy. He was a pretty talented man. And he was, the thing when I say he's talented, the thing is, he was modest, man. That guy, there's so much he could do. As tough as he was, he never had to prove anything to anybody else, and you just never even know he's in the room. He wasn't looking for attention, and that was a good man.
So then, which is probably a highlight for us, is, what would it have been? In the summer of 2015, you get a call from Roddy Piper that he's planning to write a book about the early years of his life, a really honest book, looking at the ups and downs, and he thought that you would be one of the key people that he should talk to help remember what his early years were like. And as you all can hear, my dad has a good memory and he can tell a good story. So why don't we go back to a couple of years ago when you heard from Rod?
Well, he called me and he said that he was writing a book. He's had many concussions, Rod, and so he's forgotten a lot of the things that happened growing up. And in fact, I remember Rod and I used to be bouncers in a restaurant. It was a tough restaurant, and we used to fight guys, and we got paid. It's pretty funny looking back, but we were teenagers, and we got paid, but with cheeseburgers. They didn't give us any money. We bounced in a restaurant and got paid in cheeseburgers. That's pretty crazy. So Rod, he just said, Cam, and he called himself, he said, I'm just stupid. And I've said before, Rod was not stupid. He had a lot of concussions, and that obviously affects your memory. There's a lot of things that I have forgotten, for sure, but what I do remember is probably more than Rod remembers. So he asked if I could help him. He brought his writer in, and so we came in and spent a couple of days together with the writer, going over just what it was like growing up in Winnipeg, and we went over, many of our stories together. So, it was a treat to spend a couple of days with Rod, and he had told me, I don't know if he was just talking, but he said one of the things that he did want to do is when he get his act together in the States, get out of wrestling. And he was going to open and I forgot the name of it. It was a franchise that he had a friend of his that owned these franchises. And they were going to give him a franchise. And he wanted to move to Calgary or Edmonton, he told me, and open his franchise. Now, Rod has had some dreams before, and he's talked about things, and it's never come off. So I don't know if that was just something he was throwing out there or he was serious. But that's what he was talking about when he was in Edmonton. And he said, he doesn't really have any close friends, which I find hard to believe, but Rod knows that I am a friend, and I don't care what he did for a living. He was always my buddy, and I would never forget that. So
when you met him a couple years ago, it was almost like you were reunited again. You spent the whole 2 days together. Did it feel like you were both 16 again?
Well, it did. Everybody's got pressures at work, and spending the 2 days with Rod, I forgot about work. It was just, you're exactly right. It's just like the old days, and Rod can make me laugh without even trying. And he was good for my soul, for sure, to see him. And hopefully it was the same for him with seeing me.
And I actually have a chance to tell a story because growing up, I did like hockey, but I always really liked wrestling. I thought it was just really good entertainment and the different characters and everything like that. And I always enjoyed Roddy Piper, and I did see him around growing up, but I never really got to know him. So the day he arrived, my dad sent a text, and he said, "Rod's here in the lobby of the hotel. You should come by." So I remember coming by probably right after lunch, and I was just planning to stay for half an hour, and I think that turned into 5 or 6 hours because he's just such a friendly guy. And it was pretty intimidating at first because here's one of my idols that I finally got to meet, and he didn't disappoint. I know a lot of times you meet someone who's famous or someone that you've looked up to, and they're the exact opposite of what you thought they would be. But he was extremely friendly, if not a little bit shy himself. But then as soon as he felt comfortable with me, he was definitely not shy. And I remember a conversation that he had with me, and I'm bringing this up just in case his kids happen to be listening. He was saying how much he loved his kids, and he said that he regretted that he was on the road so much and that he didn't get to spend as much time with them, and he thought maybe I should have been a stay-at-home dad, or I should have worked a 9-to-5 job. And so it sounded like he had a bit of regret. And I remember saying to him that the reason he has such a good relationship with his children is because he worked so hard for them, and that if he was home, he probably would have been miserable because he wasn't doing what he loved to do. And it seemed like it actually struck a chord with him. And I could see him thinking for a second. He said, "Thank you for saying that," and that he actually hadn't thought of it that way. So that's one moment which I couldn't believe. Here I am giving advice to Roddy Piper that it seemed like, maybe a little bit sunk in. And I think he just didn't realize the impact that he had on people. And that's why this book was really cathartic for him. I remember we were going up to his room, and we probably should have taken the elevator, but we took the stairs, and I couldn't believe how tough it was for him to get up probably 10 steps. And I think that just shows the toll that wrestling took on his body. But he didn't complain, and he didn't say, let's take the elevator. He just took his time, got up the stairs, and then he started, he said, "What's your phone number? I'm going to text you." And so of course I gave it. And then for the next month until he passed, a month or two, every day I would get texts from Roddy Piper, and it ranged from crazy conspiracy theories that were actually pretty interesting. I don't know how true they were, but I definitely would Google what he would say about 9/11 and aliens and different topics. And then he would talk about how important being a dad is. And I remember the last text that I received from him, it was on July 30th at 8 p.m. And he basically said how he wanted, how a dream wrestling match would be my dad and I against Colt, his son, and Roddy Piper.
We would have lost.
I was going to say maybe his dream, but it wouldn't have lasted. It would have been a quick dream because we would have lost in although I would have tried to be sneaky and maybe throw some salt in their eyes or something like that. I think he passed that evening. So I know I wasn't the last person he texted or talked to, but it was pretty special to have a little bit of a relationship for a month or two, and he was a pretty special person. So, Dad, do you have any last memories of Rod?
Yeah, you got to bring us some memories back. And when you talk about his last days, I was in Calgary, and I want to say it was on a Wednesday, and he was troubled about some things, and he was texting and phoning, and I still have his last messages to me the day before he died. And, so I said, well, I'll tell you what, Rod, I gotta go right now, but let's connect. He says, I'll call you on Thursday, he said, and and maybe we'll talk again Friday. He said, we'll figure something out. And then that was the last I heard of him. He just, I don't know, I think you told me that he had passed. And, you know, he knew it too, and I knew he's not going to live a full life. Like, there wasn't a chance, because those wrestlers, I've said it already, they've got a tough life. And I think there's statistics that say most of the wrestlers that are in, you know, the name guys that go through whatever they got to go through to make it where they're at, they die between, I think it's 35 and 45. So many of them have died early in life. And I remember when Rod was like 58, and I was with him, and I was thinking, I don't see this guy making it to 60. Not a hope in hell. And I believe he was 61, if I'm not mistaken, 60 or 61. So he got a little older than I thought he'd live. But again, and the last thing, when I think about Rod, you know, and I keep saying he's not a big man. When I played in Flin Flon at 19 years old, Rod was born, you know, the same year in April, and my birthday's in August, so he's a little older than me. And I weighed 191 pounds at 19 years old. I was pretty solid. I didn't have any body fat. And Rod weighed 181 at the same age. I never forgot that. And if you look at his upper body and mine, we're both, you know, decent shape. But the difference is because I played football and soccer, and I played tennis and baseball and obviously hockey. So my legs were bigger than his, and Rod played a little football and he boxed. So the 10 pounds difference was in the legs, and that was always something that bothered him, that his legs were skinny. And I remember one time we were working out at a YMCA in Winnipeg, and we worked our asses off in there. And we were in the showers after, and there was a guy right across from us with the biggest thighs that we ever saw. We're in the shower. Rod's not shy. He walked over and he said, "Excuse me, man." He said, "How do you get thighs that?" Because he wanted to get bigger legs. Well, the guy's name was Jim Heighton, and he was played for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And so he was a football player, and so, you know, that's why he had such big legs. But, yeah, so Rod was 181 and I was 191.
So as we wrap up this podcast, I guess you can give your final words about Rod. I just want to say that the month and the day that I got to spend with him, he never talked about himself. He just talked about how much he loved his kids over and over.
Yeah, it was like that. Never did talk about himself. When he died, I had Colt's phone number, because I always knew. I said, "Rod, if something happens to you, how do I ever find out about a funeral?" Because his home phone number, the phone would ring to the barn where they had the horses, so he was not the easiest guy to get hold of. And if, you know, the family didn't recognize my phone number, they might not pick up the phone. So I got Colt's cell number, and when he died, I got a hold of Colt, and he gave me the date and the time and where the funeral is going to be, and it was in Portland. And it just so happens that there was the WWE was in town too for that same day as Rod's funeral. So a lot of the wrestlers showed up, and that girl wrestler, I think her name was Chyna. I remember her sitting just behind me, and she was crying quite a bit. And I don't recognize the wrestlers like my son would have, but it's pretty weird when you're walking behind guys wearing suits. And they're like, the backs are like 3 feet wide or 4 feet. Like, they were massive men in suits. They were just monsters. So I remember looking at them just saying, "Man, my God, they don't know how to skate." So, you know, we had the funeral. It was well attended, and people got up and spoke, and Rod's kids got up and spoke, and which would have been so hard to do, you know, when you lose a loved one. I shed a few tears there for sure, and I'm very glad I got to pay my respects to Rod. Just when I look back, just to sum it up, Rod was one of a kind. He had a great energy about him. I learned so much from him. He taught me how to treat people better than I did. He treated everybody well. I learned so many lessons from him, and I'm grateful that I crossed paths with him. As I said earlier, he changed my life, and I've said it before, Rod gave a lot more than he took in this world, and I miss Rod quite a bit.
Well, thanks for sharing over 2 podcasts a bit about Roddy Piper and what he meant to you, and some behind-the-scenes stories that a lot of people would not have known. He seems like a great guy. But next episode, we're back to hockey. It's hockey season's right around the corner. I think that a few people have been asking about some more current stories or information. So the podcast will always be about hockey stories in the past and different things that you've experienced, but we will pepper in some current stories. So one area that I think you could cover is one of your friends, George McPhee, who's now the GM of the new Las Vegas team, and you could talk next week about what you think their prospects are. I know it's always tough when it's your first year, but it sounds like George McPhee is a pretty impressive person.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about George. And George and I go back to the Ranger organization. And the first time I met George, he was actually in traction in, I believe it was called the Lenox Hill Hospital. And he was on our farm team. And a fella I was tight with, Mike Backman, he said to me, he said, we got this guy named George McPhee, and he's laying in the hospital, and nobody in the Ranger organization, including management, Craig Patrick and them, none of them have gone up to see him. And and Mike Backman wasn't living in New York. He was on the farm team, so he asked me if I could go up. So I didn't know George. I went up and saw George in traction, and we were friends ever since then. So we'll talk about things like that.
And you have a great photo from back then, not when he was in traction, but back when you and Steve Martinson, I think that was his name. You have a picture on your Twitter account that a lot of people have enjoyed. So if anyone's curious of a George McPhee picture from the early 80s, check out my dad's Twitter, Cam Connor NHL. So until next week, I'm Kris.
And I'm Cam.